All right, we are going to move from the idea of the fugue to the cantata. So I mentioned that Bach was writing in pretty much every form of the day. And his cantatas were works which were intended to be performed during a church service. This is not a Catholic service. This was a Lutheran service. He was a Lutheran, although he wrote a tremendous mass, one of the great masses of all time. And he wrote a series of passions, which are works based on the life of Christ. But he also composed more than 200 cantatas, which are kind of small-scale religious works based on the weekly sermon, and they were meant to be performed as kind of musical interludes during the church service. They involve typically four vocal soloists, a soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, plus a choir and an orchestra. And Bach was employed generally by churches when he wasn't employed by the court. And he was expected to, among the many other things he had to do, was to compose cantatas for every Sunday of the year. And surviving are about 3 intact cycles, that is, each Sunday a new cantata, although we think he composed probably more like 5 of these cycles. So you can imagine, just for any composer to write that much music just for once a week is an incredible feat. And this was only a small fraction of all the music that Bach composed. It's really hard to wrap our head around how much music we have from him, and the quality is just absolutely astounding. It's a pretty miraculous concept. But so the cantatas then were meant to be performed in church, and we are going to listen to one movement, first movement from one cantata. Cantata is called Wachet auf, which means wake up, or sleepers awake is the kind of the poetic translation we have for that. And the general map, and I'll take you through it, it works like this. So we have a series of orchestral interludes interspersed with chorale phrases. And I've given you the German for the beginning of each of these phrases. So it begins with an orchestral interlude, and it's a kind of a dotted figure that drives throughout the entire movement. It's dum, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. That's the kind of general rhythmic motive that permeates the entire movement. This is incredibly beautiful music. It's moving music. But as with much Bach, it's also very serious music. It doesn't jump out at you like Vivaldi or Corelli or the Italians. Tends to be, the more you listen to it, the more you appreciate it and enjoy it. So hopefully with some time, you will become familiar with Bach's sound. Just like the fugue tends to be a pretty serious undertaking, his cantatas also were not flippant affairs, but really show a lot of religious fervor. So this is the Wachet auf, and we will listen to this with a beautiful recording here, a video of a choir. So you can hear that driving rhythm at the beginning. This is done again on original instruments, period instruments, so what the instruments look like and how they were played during Bach's day. Probably people didn't have hair like that in Bach's day. They were wearing wigs, gray wigs. Okay, you can see the choir in the background, and the continuo keyboardist would have led just like Bach would have done. Okay. So the first chorale phrase. You can hear always that dum, da-dum, da-dum going on underneath. orchestral interlude. And performers in Bach's day probably would have been reading off of written out parts, certainly would have been reading off written out parts. It would have been done by a copyist, because Bach certainly didn't have time to write out everybody's part. Let's see what the French horns looked like in his day without keys. Could only play in certain keys, and they had actually crooks, things they could insert to lengthen the tubing. Early oboes. You can hear also how the choral lines kind of ride above everything else. So if you remember back to Palestrina and how he set his mass so that words were always audible, and certainly Bach learned a lot from Palestrina as well. But always that driving rhythm underneath. Wake up, stand up. He's choir singing. So in Bach's day, there would never have been women performing musical instruments in the church. It just was not something women did, unfortunately. Now women play a vital role in the classical music world as men, and often more so. Probably in Bach's day also, the female roles here would have been sung by a boys' choir that then sang at a higher pitch. Probably also the quality of this recording is far superior to what Bach would have known. This retinue of players and singers would have had a lot of time to rehearse and perfect their craft. In Bach's day, it was basically Sunday to Sunday and get something up there that got the job done and didn't embarrass the composer. So you can imagine Bach up there with his wig, Or maybe you can't imagine. It's hard to imagine Bach, somebody of that stature, standing in this church and conducting. He's kind of a god in the musical world. But Bach probably would have been conducting from a harpsichord. Okay, so you get the idea then um, of this the kind of seriousness of the composition. This is only one movement from this Wachet auf cantata. There were probably 5 or 6. Occasionally, a few of them would have had, for example, a soprano soloist instead of the choir. And it would have, of course, ended with a choral movement with the orchestra. So that's the idea of the cantata, and you can kind of, if we think back on our religious vocal music, starting from Gregorian chant, going through masses and motets of the Renaissance, and finally into the Baroque period, where we have masses still, and we have cantatas, which were largely was not a Catholic phenomenon. This was from the Lutheran Church, and largely Bach dominated in the cantata realm. And then we have also oratorios, which we will talk about. So we're going to leave Bach now, hard as it is to do. Again, we're talking about 3 major composers during the Baroque period, although there were many, many more. We spoke first about Vivaldi, and we're going to come back to Vivaldi at the end of my discussion about the Baroque. Now we've spoken about Bach, serious composer, often contrapuntal, and very lightly traveled, very provincial, stayed home in Germany, was known as a organist and a keyboard player during his lifetime, not a composer, despite the overwhelming amount of music he composed. And now we're going to jump to George Frederick Handel, who was actually, and very curiously, born the exact same year as Bach. And as it turns out, despite extremely different lives they led, which I will tell you a little bit about Handel's life, they were treated at the end of their life both by the same doctor, who treated them both for blindness, and in neither case could he correct the illness. So both men tragically went blind at the end of their life, and it's hard to imagine what eye surgery would have felt like at the time without anesthesia and all of that, back in the 17th and 18th centuries. Not a pleasant thought. So Handel was born not far from Leipzig, in a very small town called Halle. And his father sent him to law school, unlike Bach, who was trained as a musician from the jump. Handel's parents attempted to push him into the law, into the world of lawyers, and he didn't like it. And he moves to Hamburg, which was a big bustling city at the time, and becomes a violinist and composer. From Hamburg, he traveled to Italy, absorbed the Italian style, which it tended to dominate much of what he was writing. So when we think of the Italian style, we're thinking of a lot of melody and a driving bass line, for example, and much more lighthearted music than the kinds of music that Bach tended to compose. Establishes a great reputation in Italy. In fact, it's reputed that he met Corelli at one point, and he grabbed the violinist out of Corelli's hand and said, "This is how my music's supposed to be played." And he played his own music on Corelli's violin. Might be myth, who knows? But kind of speaks to Handel's attitude. He was very self-assured, and he was a genius in the first rank, no question about it. He leaves Italy, he moves to Hanover, and he becomes a musical director at the court of Hanover, which was one of the great courts of Europe. And the ruler there, George Ludwig, would later become King George of England, which is interesting for reasons I'll tell you in just a moment. So while he's the musical director in Hanover, he travels to London. And there he finds favor with Queen Anne, and he decides to stay in London. And he builds the rest of his career in London. He's there for about 50 years, I believe, at that point. He lives to be a ripe old age. But he skirts his duties and the expectations of the things that he was contractually bound to in Hanover. And as it so happens, years later, George Ludwig becomes, through political machinations and I think marriage, he becomes George the First of England. And all of a sudden, Handel, who had left him kind of high and dry back in Germany, now realizes that his new employer is the same man that kind of jaded back in Germany. So he tries to make good on that by composing something called the Water Music, which is not a piece we're going to listen to because we just don't have enough time, but you probably have heard of the idea of Handel's Water Music before. If not, it was a work that Handel intended to be performed on the water and on huge boats, and very brilliant music with lots of loud sounds and brass and this kind of thing, very festive. And his intent was, as his boat came by George the First's on the Thames River, I think, in London, playing this fantastic music for the king, that the king then would realize what a great composer he was and put him back into his favor. Handel, like Bach, composed in every genre. Actually, there's one genre that Bach never composed, and that was opera. And that makes sense if you understand Bach's seriousness, because opera tended to be high drama, and the Italian style was much lighter than the kinds of things Bach was composing. But Handel loved this style, and he moves to London, and he really builds his reputation composing Italian opera. So he is a German. He's in England now, speaking English, but Italian opera becomes all the rage during the Baroque period. That is the music for the masses now. We're not in a church, we're not in the public square, but the Italian opera style became very, very popular. And we're going to talk more about that with time. And Handel understood that, and he began composing Italian opera. And this was great for quite a long time. He made a lot of money. He established a great reputation. He was great in demand. And until it all seemed to go south. And eventually, the English grew tired of the Italian opera. They had a problem with kind of the formal types that existed. It was a very kind of routine kind of things that would happen on stage. And one of the things was called the exit aria, where a performer kind of endeared him or herself, in most of the cases himself, probably even when they were playing female roles, to the audience, and then would sing a big aria and then would exit the stage. And this became a rather tiresome affair for the English audiences. They also had problems with the fact that ultimately it was in a language most of them didn't understand. They also had a problem with the idea of the castrato. And this is a rather uncomfortable idea, but male singers were often castrated in order to preserve their upper quality of their voices. Something for us hard to wrap our heads around today. But if you imagine the purity of a boys' choir or a boys' singer, this was something that was very attractive, this sound, to audiences and to composers. And it had a long tradition. There was a very famous movie called Farinelli, if you're interested in checking that out at some point, about a very famous castrato singer who basically dominated the musical world in the time of Handel, for example. But the English had an issue with what was happening with the singers. And they also saw this dominance of Italian music as threatening their own English theater. So Handel took a chance and decided to try to give them something new. And that was the oratorio. And the oratorio was a work generally based on a religious theme. Could be Old Testament or New Testament. In fact, his first oratorio was an Old Testament theme or an idea story. But his great oratorio was the Messiah. And we're going to talk about a few pieces from the Messiah. So as opposed to opera, oratorio was, despite its religious concepts or its anchor, was not meant to be performed in church, but were performed in large theaters like opera, but they were not staged, they were not acted out, there was no scenery, there were no costumes. There was an orchestra, there was a chorus, and there was a group of soloists. In a certain sense, it's kind of like the cantata we just watched on a much larger scale, except the cantatas were intended for church. But in terms of the forces involved, um, the oratorio has certain ideas in common with that. So Handel's greatest oratorio, and he wrote quite a few of them, these are English text works, so the audience could understand them all, was The Messiah, which was in 3 parts, or is in 3 parts. It's still performed all the time. I perform it almost every year, which basically tracks the life of Jesus, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. It's not a start-to-finish story. It's frequently reflections on leading a Christian life, for example. But again, it's a religious work, but it's not meant for the church. It's a large-scale performance. And we're going to watch and talk about a few of these numbers. So the first we're going to listen to is called "Rejoice Greatly, O Daughter of Zion." It's a soprano aria, and in fact, this one is called a da capo aria. Da capo in Italian means to the head, like this head, which is kind of, I see, kind of messy this morning. Sorry about that, but it's the way it is. To the head, meaning you repeat back to the beginning. So in a da capo aria, and if you remember, the aria is a portion of, it was originally from opera, now it's being absorbed into oratorio as well, where you have an opening set of material, theme, and the idea is developed. This is not just a theme by itself, but it's a large section. And this is going to be contrasted, and in this case, it's a very fast-moving and almost virtuosic section. And it's contrasted with a B section. In the case of this aria, "Rejoice Greatly," it's much slower and calmer. And then the A section is repeated. So the composer only wrote out 2 sections. Wrote out an A section, wrote out a B section, and then wrote a repeat sign like I showed you before, which looked kind of like this. Where'd it go? Oh, sorry. Come back here. Would have 2 dots. Okay, I'm not going to get it there, so I'm going to put it here. 2 dots and that. There it is. And then basically the performance would go back to the first section and repeat it again, which gives it the A, B, A form. And often in the A section, there was some embellishment, some kind of improvisation. Sometimes they would add trills or turns or things that were kind of fancy. But the idea basically is still a rounded ABA section. Okay, so we're going to listen now to this "Rejoice, Daughters of Zion" aria from Handel's Messiah. So it starts with an orchestra introduction. You can see the harpsichord down here. Black keys, white keys inverted, like I told you about. Okay, here's our soprano soloist. All in English, "Rejoice, Daughter of Zion." This is all part of the opening A section of the staccato aria. Okay, contrasting B section. We've just gone into the minor mode. It's a little slower, reflective. It's all reflecting on Jesus' role as Son of God. So you can see here the choir back here, but they are not used in this number. So there are other numbers, many of them, in the Messiah, where it would be choir singing. In fact, we're going to hear that in just a moment. And then a soloist, in this case the soprano, will step forward and sing her aria with the orchestra. All of the numbers involve the orchestra. It's just sometimes it's with chorus, and sometimes it's with a soloist or two soloists, for example. You can hear the long cadence. And then orchestra repeats back to the beginning. And their music is exactly what they played the first time. And then it was expected that the singers, for example, or the soloists, do some embellishing the second time around. Actually, in this aria, I believe Handel writes out the differences for the singer. This is actually another one of the soloists, but not involved in this number. And that's all of her aria. Now the orchestra will finish up with a postlude of its own, based on the original material. Okay, so that is one number of many from Handel's Messiah. And I want to play for you another work, which is on your listening as well, a work that most of you are going to be familiar with, which is the Hallelujah Chorus. As I try hard to get it to pop up here. Come on, Mario. Hallelujah Chorus. Wow, there we go. Hallelujah Chorus. Okay, so I told you that the Messiah is in three large parts, and the Hallelujah closes part two, the text announcing the reign of Jesus, who's now been in the oratorio, has been resurrected. We actually don't, as I said, don't follow it story by story, but it's more of a reflection on the action of what's happened. And this course is divided into 5 sections. And this is kind of typical of how these choral numbers are constructed. So as opposed to the da capo aria we just heard with the soprano soloist, the choral numbers tend to bank back and forth between orchestral sections and choral parts. And in this number, we have 5 large sections with the chorus. It opens with Hallelujah, and I'll take you through this as we go. Then there's a B section, and each of these are very distinctive in not only with the text, but kind of how they're set. Then there's a second section, the B section, with the text for the Lord our God, and we have wide orchestral leaps that suggest the great power of God. C section, the kingdom of the Lord. And we have big shifts of texture here, which are supposed to represent musically the kingdom of the world on earth and the kingdom in heaven. Then we have a section which introduces in kind of fugal style, that is the counterpoint that we remember from Bach. Handel was also a master of counterpoint, and we have a lot of contrapuntal music in his compositions, and this is a small section in this movement that is actually fugal in style. It's not a true fugue, but it's based on elements of counterpoint. We will hear that based on the text, "And he shall reign." And some of this will sound very familiar to a lot of you because it's played every year. And then finally, King of Kings, when we're going to hear the sopranos against kind of pedal points in the orchestra, and that's alternating with the chorus singing the Hallelujah idea. And then finally, a big dramatic pause at the end and an amen cadence. Okay, so with any luck, down here, we can hear the famous Hallelujah chorus. Sorry. Okay, don't do much about that. There it goes. Sorry about this. Well, a slight advertisement. You can all imagine what it would be like to be at the beach on a cruise ship, which I will probably never. All right. This is in England, famous, very famous concert hall, the Royal Albert Hall. So this is the end of part 2 of this huge sprawling oratorio. Okay, you can see the 4 soloists up front. Here goes the back of the orchestra, and the chorus. She's not singing very loud. Okay. Second section. It's a little darker with these Hallelujah interrupted. Now you can get a sense of just how big this concert hall is. Next section. And here comes the fugal section. You hear the answer to the fugue subject. And again, subject. Right, next section, King of Kings, with the Hallelujah idea against it. Famous trumpet. More fugal style. organist actually way up in the top there. And we're going to have a big dramatic pause and a final amen cadence. Okay, so you have then the end of part 2, then there will be a break in the action. You will get up and stretch and come back for part 3. But it gives you an idea of kind of the majesty of the English oratorio in Handel's hands. So we have a large orchestra for that day. We have 4 vocal soloists. We have a huge chorus. In this case, we have the organist back here. And this would then end part 2 of a large 3-part work, which takes probably close to 2 hours to perform the whole thing. Not meant to be performed in church, of course. It's a theatrical event, but it's not acted out. Okay, so that's the idea of the oratorio, the English oratorio. Italian opera continued to be performed in Italy, of course, but the English were so attracted to the oratorio idea that it made Handel even more famous and wealthier than he had been at that point. He died fat and happy, except for the fact that he was blind, I guess. So I'm going to end with our presentation of this music of the Baroque with a work by Vivaldi. So we're going to circle back around. So just as a recap, we had the Italian violin school that was represented by Corelli at the beginning that Vivaldi took over and dominated. And although he composed in many genres, which we're going to talk about one in just a moment, he's remembered largely for what he did with the violin and with instrumental music in general. Bach wrote in all fields except opera, tends to be serious. A lot of it was religious in nature and highly contrapuntal. I would say of the 3 of these, Bach is considered to be the greatest, but also that which probably takes the most listening to in order to appreciate and understand. And Handel, who was the most cosmopolitan of all these figures, traveled widely, absorbed styles from everywhere, and composed in very successfully in all forms: operas, trio sonatas, and chamber music, oratorio, which is a genre that he basically almost invented and then dominated, orchestral music, vocal music of all kinds, secular, sacred, extremely prolific, as was Bach, but widely accepted as one of the great composers of his day at the time where Bach was largely an unknown. With time, as I mentioned, Bach's reputation grew with people understanding his music and getting a hold of it, which hadn't really been published during his lifetime, and he became recognized as probably the greatest composer of all time, certainly the greatest composer of the Baroque period, even though these 2 composers had far greater reputations during their lifetimes than Bach did. I want to end, however, with swinging back to Vivaldi, and I would like you to watch this production. It's a BBC production that's from England, but it's a performance of Vivaldi's Gloria. So this was a work based on the Catholic Mass, and so it's for chorus and orchestra. And this is a stunning production that's filmed on location in Venice. For those of you who don't know what Venice is like, it's a city built on water canals. As you recall, in Vivaldi's day, he worked in the ospedale, the conservatory, or the orphanage, training these young girls to be performers. And in this performance, it's done as it would have been done in Vivaldi's day by all women performing, both in the chorus and the orchestra. And I believe in this production, they're also performing behind a screen, which I spoke about being something that was necessary in Vivaldi's day because it was not felt proper for women to be seen in their entirety by an audience performing instruments. It's a beautiful performance. I'd like you to watch it. Sit back, turn your volume up, and enjoy the production. And I will see you on Monday, February 8th, I believe. Watch for an announcement for that. Please watch all these videos, enjoy them, and please go back and listen to, connect with the links and listen to the pieces that I've talked about so that you can hear them with better sound than through my computer, and listen to them uninterrupted by me. All right, take care.